Matthew Driscoll, professor of Old Norse philology at the Arne Magnian Institute for Nordic Studies at the University of Copenhagen, is here to share with us a wealth of information about manuscripts and the manuscript culture which flourished in Iceland during the so-called Saga Age. First, let's get into some numbers to understand how many manuscripts Iceland actually produced. How are they divided between writing periods? For example, 13th century versus 14th century manuscripts? How many inhabitants were there in Iceland during this period? The writing culture seems to have been unusually thriving for an agricultural society with no urban centers.
We have, considering the population of Iceland was rather small and Iceland was on the fringes of the inhabitable universe, as it were, a remarkably large number of manuscripts seem to have been produced in Iceland in the Middle Ages. It's hard to say exactly how many were produced, and it's even hard to say exactly how many still exist, and I'll explain that. First, it depends on what you mean by a manuscript, and it depends on what you mean by the Middle Ages. But to keep things fairly simple, when I talk about manuscripts, I mean codices, in other words, books. So if we ignore things like charters and diplomas, that sort of thing, which were also written in the Middle Ages, if we don't talk about them, just talk about things that are or were books. And in terms of defining the Middle Ages, normally in the context of Iceland anyway, the Middle Ages are thought to have ceased in the middle of the 16th century. And there are various reasons. There are linguistic grounds for this, certain changes in the Icelandic language that we don't need to go into, but mark the difference between Old Icelandic and Modern Icelandic. And then things like, in particular, the Protestant Reformation, which was complete in 1550 in Iceland. And various other things happened in the 16th century, which we can say changed things so that we can talk about a more modern rather than a medieval society. You have the printing press arrives in Iceland in 1530. You have the arrival of paper, coincidentally, which replaced the previously used vellum or calfskin, which is what manuscripts were on, which meant that it was easier to get hold of, cheaper, and the number of manuscripts then produced increased. So we have from Iceland in the period from the middle of the 12th century until 1550, we have something like 750 manuscripts, Icelandic manuscripts, in the vernacular, so in Icelandic rather than in Latin. We don't know exactly how many, for the simple reason that a lot of these manuscripts are defective or fragmentary. In fact, more than half of them, just over 50% of them, are 5 leaves or fewer, out of a book that must have been, who knows, certainly larger than that. And the problem is when you have so many fragments, it's not always clear whether 2 fragments might have come from the same manuscript originally or not. So we have to be kind of vague about this, which is why we say something in the vicinity of 750. How large or how small a proportion that is of the manuscripts that once existed is, of course, extremely difficult to say. But evidence, both internal, in other words, from Iceland itself, of various kinds, and also comparative evidence from other countries, suggests that it's probably not more than 15% that we have. So we have, as I say, a very large number of manuscripts surviving, but which is only 15% and probably less of what must have existed. So this is a large amount of stuff being produced for a relatively small, isolated population. Why? Nobody knows. That's the big secret. But Icelanders have always been interested, it seems, in books and in writing, and with the result that we have, and they were world famous in the Middle Ages, even for their manuscripts.
So besides the manuscripts, we have a large number has been lost.
Yeah.
What were the main causes of the destruction of manuscripts?
Well, the Reformation obviously led immediately to the destruction or reuse of a lot of Catholic liturgical manuscripts. So there's very, very little of that left. Because vellum is, quite a useful substance, you can do lots of things with it. They were mostly repurposed rather than just being thrown away. And they often wound up being cut up and the leaves used in bookbinding. So some of them actually reappear and continue to reappear when book bindings on manuscripts, older manuscript bindings, are changed because they're broken or defective or whatever. Little bits of manuscripts come out of them. So that's one of the major causes of manuscripts being destroyed, was the Reformation, as I say. The other was simply that people read them and they disappeared as a result just by being handled by unwashed Icelandic farmers' hands, Mm-hmm. But also the changes, the script changes over time, and continues to do so. You can tell by looking at somebody's handwriting more or less what generation they are, even today, I think. And there were, changes in the course of the Middle Ages, so that by the 14th century, the earlier manuscripts from the 13th century, let's say, would have been difficult for people to read. Linguistic changes weren't so great in Icelandic as in other languages, as we know. The morphology more or less remained the same. The pronunciation has changed, but that doesn't show up on the manuscripts. But certainly the changes in the handwriting, and to some extent changes in the language itself, meant that people found it difficult to read the older manuscripts, and so they would recopy them or have them recopied so that they were easier to read. But just, generally I think things that get used tend to disappear. If you think of the books on your own bookshelf, you think, what happened to that copy I had of something? Yeah. And maybe you lent it to somebody, maybe somebody stole it.